Hello and welcome to Chapter 1 of your P2 Advanced Management Accounting course for CIMA with Practice Tests Academy. We're going to start off with this subject looking at activity-based costing and activity-based management and see that as an alternative to traditional absorption costing. Now, the CGMA cost transformation model put together by CIMA encourages us to think about the fact that what organisations do is spend money to create value. So costs are transformed into value that customers are prepared to pay for. Or should we say some cost doesn't add any value, and we should seek to minimise those. So the cost transformation model is considering where these costs lead. Do they add value ultimately, or do they not? So the 6 aspects we see in front of us here are dealt with in more detail just below. So first of all, a cost-conscious culture means, for example, any costs that don't add value, we should seek to minimise those. And in fact, the ones that do add value, we should still aim to maintain efficiency so that we don't spend excessive cost adding that value. There are risks that come from a cost-conscious culture, though, such as threatening quality and customer satisfaction, cutting corners, buying cheaper quality raw materials and so on. And there has to be a clear understanding of how those kind of things will impact on the value created from that cost expenditure. Connecting products with profitability. So understanding what drives costs for each product and allocating shared costs as accurately as possible helps you to genuinely understand whether or not the value that people are prepared to pay for exceeds the cost of actually making that item. So it's focusing on the relationship between value and cost and hopefully maximising that value, making sure that value is sustainable. So thinking longer term relationship between cost and revenue, not just short term, and understanding where those costs come from in the first place, what activities the organisation undertakes that drives cost, and understanding whether those activities are valued by customers or not. And if they are, fine. If they're not, we should seek to minimise those activities. Let's remind ourselves about activity-based costing. Activity-based costing has been around since the late 1980s. It's essentially a refinement of traditional absorption costing. Now, traditional absorption costing, if you remember, identifies cost centres as physical places in the factory and uses that physical location to assign costs to that particular location, either by allocating them direct to that location or apportioning them between locations if necessary, and then absorbing those costs into production on the basis of per unit produced in that location, or per labour hour incurred, or per machine hour incurred. The problem is, though, that quite often the labour hour or machine hour doesn't drive the cost in that particular location. It doesn't drive the particular cost that we're trying to relate to output. So activity-based costing seeks to try and keep the connection between the cost and what drives it. It essentially redefines a cost centre, calls them a cost pool now, but what makes you put costs in one cost pool rather than another is what drives that cost. So here we have some examples of cost pools. You might have material handling costs or machine setup costs are 2 good examples. Now, if you think about the things that happen when you set up machinery for a production run, you might have to pay someone to set the machinery up, then maybe someone else to calibrate the machinery, someone to do a little sample run and make sure it's working okay. And all those costs are driven by the number of setups the organisation undertakes. So anything to do with setting up machinery, let's put all those costs in the setup cost pool, and we can absorb the costs on the basis of the number of setups we incur making the different products. And then we're going to get a cost per unit that reflects the activity that went into making that particular product in the first place. Now, the traditional absorption costing systems assume everything is driven by volume. But in a modern environment in particular, that's not necessarily the case. There are all kinds of different activities that organisations undertake that drive costs that aren't related to volume. So just some examples in your notes, handling materials, buying materials, number of setups, production scheduling, inspection activities of perhaps goods inwards or some items on your production line, various things like that. And activity-based costing then does a much better job at keeping a relationship between the cost and what actually drives it. The ABC process itself feels, in fact, when you're doing the numbers, very similar to traditional absorption costing. It's just that we've redefined, if you remember, what we mean by a cost centre here. It's a cost pool now, and what helps you to decide where to put those costs, which cost pool to put them in, is the activity that drives those costs. So first thing you need to do is to identify what the major activities are within the business, and then try and work out how much cost is associated with performing each activity, and they're known therefore as the cost pools. Then you measure what drives the cost in that cost pool. So for example, the number of setups will affect the cost of setting up machinery. And then you calculate sort of a mini overhead absorption rate. So it might be rate per setup, and that's typically just the size of the cost pool divided by the level of cost drivers, or the amount of cost drivers that occurs in that particular cost pool. So you end up with an absorption rate of, say, cost per setup by working out the total setup costs and dividing that by the number of setups you think you're going to make in the year. Now, activity-based costing as a hierarchy of costs, this is useful to sort of, particularly if the question is asking you when activity-based costing is likely to make the biggest impact in the business. In other words, when it's going to give you a much better answer for cost per unit. And that is generally when lots of the costs are at the batch related level or the product sustaining level. If lots of the costs are at the unit level or the facility sustaining level, then activity-based costing won't make a massive amount of difference to cost per unit compared to the traditional approach. Now, a unit level activity means every time you produce an item, you incur some cost. We typically call that variable cost. And ABC is all about allocating overheads. So if lots of your costs are variable costs, then you haven't got many overheads. Facility sustaining activities on the other end of the spectrum, they aren't really driven by anything. They just occur. So factory rent, for example, would be a good example of facility sustaining activity. It's not really an activity, it's a facility sustaining cost. It just happens. And in terms of saying what drives that, well, nothing really. So you end up apportioning that cost on the basis of floor space or something like that, just like you would have done under a traditional costing system. So you don't get a different answer there. If lots of costs though happen, or lots of overheads happen at the batch level, which means every time you have a production run you incur those costs, then looking at the number of production runs will give you a much better answer for cost per unit. So ABC will be really good there. And similarly with product sustaining activities, that tends to be every time you produce a different product, you incur the cost. So if you imagine producing, say, 1 million items that are all identical, well, you might have one marketing campaign for those. But if you produce 10 lots of 100,000 products, so you've got 10 different products, 100,000 each, then you've got 10 times as many products on your book. So you probably have 10 times as much marketing cost because you're likely to have a marketing campaign per product that you launch. So product sustaining activities are driven by the variety in the product range, and that again means that ABC will particularly improve your answer for cost per unit. Okay. Now, ABC can help the business make some much better quality decisions. It sounds like a fairly sort of simple thing to say, well, it's only measuring cost per unit, but the importance of cost per unit really is quite profound, particularly if you base your prices on cost. then it will give you a better informed price or basis for your pricing if you've got a better idea for how much your items cost. Do I outsource or not? You can think about the cost that you'll save using activity-based costing. It helps to identify which particular products are properly loss-making or the amount of cost associated with certain departments or activities. So it means that you can focus more of your attention on what makes more money. And control the things that don't make any money, so reduce activity that drives unnecessary cost. So there are lots of benefits with activity-based costing then. Fundamentally, they all spring from the idea of having a better feel for cost per unit. And because of that, you get a better understanding of how your costs behave and what drives those costs. And as a result of that, you can then, you're in the best place possible to understand how to reduce your costs. So, why doesn't everybody do it then? You might think, well, why do we ever bother studying traditional absorption costing if activity-based costing is so good? Well, it's not perfect as a technique. There's no particular evidence that shows that ABC overall improves corporate profitability, and that's as a result of several different research studies. It costs money to try and find the information that you need and to be able to work out the cost drivers and the cost driver rates. So it costs money. It's backwards looking, so it looks really at how things have been behaved in the past. So if you're thinking of doing things a different way, activity-based costing is not particularly easy to apply. In practice, you've got to think about what drives the cost. Now, in the exam, that's not so much a problem because you'll be faced with limited options, but in the real world, you just sit staring at your desk thinking, what drives the purchasing department? Is it the number of orders that we place? Well, yes. Is it how big those orders are? Probably. Is it how complicated the orders are? Yes, probably that as well. You know, so you're left thinking, well, I'm not quite sure exactly how much detail to go into here. And because of that and the amount of information that you need, it perhaps doesn't get applied as a technique as often as it might otherwise. So let's remind ourselves about how the calculations work just briefly for activity-based costing. So we have Sledge Company here that manufactures 3 types of tablets and operates a traditional absorption costing system. We're now thinking of going for activity-based costing on a trial basis. So a time-based cost driver, in other words, how much time we spend doing different things, is used to charge the procurement cost to the tablets under the ABC system. The following unit manufacturing costs have been determined using traditional absorption costing and activity-based costing. So here we've got the activity-based costing measures of what's going on with the procurement costs for the 3 different tablets, the Star, the Air and the Galaxy. And we've got 3 statements here, and we need to try and decide which statement best fits which tablet. So this tablet uses a lot of parts and materials that are readily available. This tablet has relatively few components, and these are generally purchased in bulk. And this tablet uses a lot of parts and materials that are difficult to obtain, and so places the buying department under pressure. So I might take statement 3 first there then. If it sounds to me like there's a lot of awkward activity associated with that one, so I imagine that's going to be the product that's got the highest activity-based cost as far as procurement's concerned. So that would be tablet Star, because a lot of effort, it sounds like it goes into getting the right parts. So that's statement 3 relates to the Star. Next one, this tablet has relatively few components, and these are generally purchased in bulk. Now it could be Air or Galaxy there, few components in bulk, and you know, so that would make them sound certainly a little bit less expensive than the Star product. So applying my best exam technique, I'm going to park that one for a minute and come back to that statement when I've had a look at the other one. This tablet uses a lot of parts and materials that are readily available. Well, that sounds like that's going to make it very cheap then. So I think that's probably the Galaxy. So the Galaxy Tablet 1, which by default means that the Air is Tablet 2. Yes, it is cheaper than the Star. It has relatively few components, and these are generally purchased in bulk. Okay, we're now going to extend the application of activity-based costing into a slightly different area, activity-based management. And fundamentally, activity-based management is really just applying activity-based costing in lots of different ways, lots of different types of analysis in the organisation. Essentially, what it tries to do is identify which activities in the organisation add value and which ones don't add value, and it helps to understand the cost of each. So the clear aim of this is to save costs by cutting down on non-value adding activities, because they are essentially wasted activities. So just as a quick example, moving inventory around doesn't change the quality of the product. It doesn't affect the customer experience. So that is an activity that doesn't add any value. So we should try and minimize movement of inventory. The output from the activity-based management type process would be the following. So first of all, the costs and activities of our business processes. So we understand how much our activities cost, and then we'd split those between value adding and non-value adding. And particularly, it will tell us the cost of those non-value adding activities that we want to try and minimize. It may well also help us to introduce activity-based performance measures. So we might identify, for example, well, as we said earlier, stock movement. Well, that doesn't add any value. So we'll set a target for how many miles each component travels before it gets to the customer, and we'll try and minimize that. And that overall will help to minimize our costs in a way that doesn't compromise quality. We get a much more accurate idea of product or service. So cost, so that will help with things like pricing and to focus our marketing on the more profitable items. And it also helps to demonstrate what drives cost. And that just, there's a saying in management accounting, what gets measured gets done. So by giving visibility to what drives cost, we'll just focus minds a little bit on how we can reduce costs by watching the amount of activity that we undertake. What we're going to spend a little bit of time on now is looking at some of the different ways in which activity-based costing can be applied under this umbrella term, activity-based management. So first of all, we have direct product profitability. This is something that's often used in the retail sector, which looks at how much profit each individual product actually earns us. And of course, underpinning that profit is revenue and cost. Revenue is our sales price, but the cost per unit comes from activity-based costing here. This is essentially like analysing your income statement by product line to work out which ones you want to focus on. So here's an illustration for us to work through. So here we can see we've got what is essentially a cost card for product A. We've got selling price, less bought in price. So if you imagine we're a retailer, that'll be what we sell it to the customer for. That's what we bought it for from our suppliers, meaning we make a gross profit of 1.2, but, well, $1.20. There are other costs that we incur because of the activity involved in collecting that product, warehousing it, storing it, those kinds of things. And using activity-based costing, we can say how much that costs per product to give us a direct product profit of 67 cents. So the warehousing costs might include things like labour, space taken up, and insurance costs. Transport costs might include labour, fuel and vehicle maintenance and so on. So direct product profitability gets better decisions because you understand the cost of your products better. Helps you to price what you're selling in the shop as well, because you're getting an understanding of what the full cost is of not only just purchasing that product from the suppliers, but also the incidental costs, your own costs associated with moving that product around and so on. It also helps to identify what the costs are associated with storage and warehousing, so hopefully you can reduce those costs by having visibility of how those costs behave. You might decide to reduce product ranges and reduce complexity to make things easier to manage. Now, often direct product profitability in the modern retail environment is almost automatically produced using some software. So a direct product profitability software system would need to keep track of what we're selling things for and what we're buying it in at. So that's to get your gross margin, how often they're sold, because if something turns over quickly, if it comes in and goes out quickly, even though you don't make much margin on each one you sell, you could still make a lot of profit. That's almost like a throughput accounting type of an idea there. How big it is as well, because that will help to drive or help you to understand what drives costs in the warehouse. So inventory holding size and product size, how many you can fit on a pallet, that's sort of telling you how much space it will take up on the warehousing shelves. How complicated and time consuming it is to order and distribute the product. So here we have a little test your understanding. All in one is a supermarket group that incurs the following costs. Which ones of these would be included in direct product profitability? Well, the bought-in price, yes, that's our major item of cost. Shelf refilling cost, if we've got that information, that would be great to know. Inventory financing cost, that's money tied up while it's sitting in inventory, that's relevant. And costs of pack out prior to storage before sale. That sounds like it relates to that particular product. So yes, that was all relevant. So all the above costs, provided you have all the information on those things, would be great things to include. Another application of activity-based costing type information is to customer profitability analysis. And imagine this one as like analysing your income statement by customer or customer type. Some customers are more profitable than others, and to understand the true profitability of our customers, we need to understand the amount of effort and activity that goes into servicing them, keeping them happy. So for example, a bank, activities involved in servicing customers in a bank would involve giving them facilities to withdraw cash, providing them with unauthorised overdrafts and how we deal with that, sending them letters and so on, requests for statements, stopping a cheque, returning a cheque because of insufficient funds. All these things drive costs, so we need to understand the incidence of these things and how much each one costs to understand how much money we're making from different customer types. Imagine a hotel. A hotel might have activities for specific types of customers, such as decent gardens, a swimming pool for people to use, or a bar for people to drink at. Older guests might enjoy the gardens, families might enjoy the swimming pool, business people might enjoy the bar if they're staying away from home during the week, for example. And all these different activities incur different types of cost. So to try and understand which customers are costing more than others, we need to understand the cost of looking after the gardens, the swimming pool and the bar, to get a better idea then of how much our different customer types cost us, and therefore how much profit we earn from them. Now, some customers are more profitable than others, and this section brings in the idea of a Pareto curve, and all Pareto analysis means is sometimes known as 20-80, the 20-80 rule. 20% of our customers provide us with 80% of the profit. In other words, some customers are bigger and more profitable than others. So here's an example of a customer profitability curve. We've got percentage of customers served along the bottom and the percentage of profit that we make out of them going along the side there. So you can see here that approximately 20% of our customers are earning as 80% of our profit. Now, there's no magic behind saying 20-80. It might not be exactly 20-80. You know, it could be 15% of your customers earn 85% of the profit. All we're saying here is that it's concentrated in a relatively small number of customers. Interestingly, on this graph, look, you can see that towards the tail end, actually, there are some customers that appear to reduce our profitability. That might be because there's such a lot of effort is required in looking after those customers that actually the costs are outweighing the revenue we get from them. And it's useful information to have that because, of course, for these guys, we're losing money. So maybe we want to think about how we avoid those kind of customers going forwards, potentially. Okay, let's have a look at an example, shall we? So we've got various different this could be customers here rather than products. It could be either actually, but let's say customers because it's customer profitability analysis. So we've got customers A, B, C, D, E, F and G. Contributions in thousands of dollars there on the right hand side. And our question is being asked here on the basis of Pareto analysis, which of the following pairs of customers earn more than 80% of the total contribution? So what I might do at this point is redraft that table slightly just to put them in order, if you like. So if I start off with customer G, that gives me a contribution of 900, and I've picked on that one because that's the largest, and I'll do a cumulative column, so that's 900 there. And then the next most profitable one would be customer F, that earns us 440, so that gives me a cumulative of 1340. So they're our top two. So I can imagine there that we've pretty much got the answer. Just to check that that is our answer, let's just add down and find out what the total contribution is from all our customers. And I think if we add that down, we get 1547. So 1340, which is our cumulative after the first two, over 1547 is slightly over 80%, so 87%. So that certainly gives us most of our value. So it's pairs G and F that give us over 80% of our value. G and F, so the right answer there is B. This 80-20 rule was a concept that was first noticed by a chap called Vilfredo Pareto a long time ago in Italy, and he observed that 80% of the wealth in Milan was owned by 20% of its citizens. In other words, you get concentrations of wealth, and he was one of the first people to sort of note this idea of concentrations. So he's just saying that 20% of the citizens had 80% of the wealth. And this idea of 80-20, say, don't feel that it's going to be exactly 80% and 20% all the time. We're just saying we get concentrations in a population. You can this is what's known as Pareto analysis, and the procedure that you walk through to draw one of these graphs is to first of all rank the data in descending order, which is what we started doing in the last example. Find each figure as a percentage of the total and turn that into a cumulative percentage, and the results can be plotted in a diagram, and you can see then how the concentration affects the shape of the curve on the diagram. So as with a lot of these things, easiest to see by way as an example. So the example we're going to work through here, test your understanding for. We manufacture 7 products here. Following data relates to the most recent period, and we're asked to draw a Pareto diagram of this particular data. So the first thing we're going to do is put them into descending order and work out a cumulative and a percentage. So the biggest one there is product C, with a contribution of 750, cumulative 750, and as a percentage, well, the first thing we need is what the total is of that table to be able to work out a percentage, and that table adds up in total to 1217. So 750, we'll do this one in full, 750 as a percentage would be 750 divided by that 1217 to give us a percentage that relates to product C, which is 62. So that's C done. Our next most profitable one is looking at that. D, next biggest number. So that's another 240 on there. That makes that 990 in total, and that covers 81% of the value. So there's the 2080 idea we can see again, more or less. And the next biggest one is, that's D done. The next biggest one is A, 95. And by the time we add that one in, our cumulative is now up to over 1,085, and that's 89%. Then the next one, so that's A done. Next biggest one is E. E gives us 60. So that takes us up to 1145. 94%. Then we move on to B at 35. That takes us up to 1180. That's 97%. Then G, another 25. That takes us to 1205. Nearly there now, 99%. And then finally F, another 12, takes us up to the 1217. And that gives us 100%. So what we do now is plot a graph. So here's one I prepared earlier, showing how the value builds up. So we've got the products going down across there on the x-axis, and the cumulative contribution being shown up there on the y-axis. And we can see a curve that's roughly that sort of a shape. It's sort of bending over. And you'd expect that because the products earlier on are very profitable. They're less profitable as we go up the curve. That's Pareto analysis. You can also apply the idea of activity-based costing to the different distribution channels you might have. So for example, you might sell some direct to customers over the internet, and sell some via shops or via distribution chains. And they've all got their own costs and activities associated with them. So ABC can help you to understand which distribution channels are more profitable than others, and to enable you to focus on the more profitable ones. So there we are, that's chapter 1, guys. In chapter 1 we've had a recap of activity-based costing, but then considered that the concept of activity-based costing can be applied in lots of different ways in the organisation. So what you need to do now is make sure you're happy with the content of the chapter, then have a go at the questions that are on the screen at the end of this chapter now, before you then hit the question bank. And I'll see you back here for chapter 2. Thanks for listening.